They said she was nobody, a stepdaughter kept below the floor of a house that bore her father's name, locked away like a poor secret before the most powerful man in the iron reckoning ever crossed the threshold. They said she had no standing, no bloodline worth recording, no face worth presenting to a king. Marin Nightshade had 31 witnesses and a sealed cellar door to prove it. What no one counted on was the scent. What no one counted on was an alpha king who stopped mid-stride in a candlelit hall and turned his head toward stone, toward dark, toward the one woman in the keep who had been told she did not exist. This is the account of what followed in the year 1182 of the Iron Reckoning, on the night the sealed moon sat over the Iron Hollow ridgeline and refused to move. The hall of Nightshade Keep had been dressed for a king. Sella had watched them do it from the corner where Marin kept her. A small elderly woman in gray linen who could see 3 generations of social theater and recognize each gesture. Pine boughs tied to the bracket iron, fresh tallow in the holders, the worn flagstones swept clean of grain dust and the smell of working animals. Marin had ordered the household steward dress to arrange the 31 packmates and council escorts in 2 formal lines before the hearth, and Drest had complied with the small private pleasure of a man who liked arrangement. He had sent word twice to the kitchen that the spiced wine must be heated, not warm, and he had corrected a lesser guard's posture by gripping his shoulder without asking. Sella had noted all of it. She had also noted the candle burning at the top of the cellar stairs, now extinguished. Cain had been below since the 3rd hour of morning. Marin had come to Cain's room before first light, which was unusual enough that Cain had been awake and already dressed, her hands smelling of the dried lavender and woundwort she kept in the windowsill crock for the household's sick duty. Marin had not knocked. She had opened the door with the flat authority of a woman who owned every threshold in the building, looked at Cain the way a housekeeper looks at a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room, and said the king would be inspecting the tithe records by mid-afternoon. "You will go to the cellar," Marin had said. "You will remain there until I send Dress to release you. You will not make noise." Cain had looked at her stepmother's face and found, as she always did, the smooth plane of certainty there. Marin was not cruel out of heat or anger. She was methodical. She had been methodical in the year after Cain's father died, when she had reassigned Cain from the upper rooms to the sick ward corridor, then from sick ward to kitchen labor, then from kitchen to the general household maintenance that placed her hands in lye and her boots in frost every second morning. Cain had learned to read the direction of travel in Marin's face, and to stop expecting it to reverse. She had picked up her crock of woundwort, wrapped her coat around her shoulders against what she already knew the cellar would feel like, and gone. The cellar ran 2 full flights of stone stairs below the hall floor. It was old, older than the keep's current stones, carved into bedrock when the iron hollow pack had first needed a cold room against summer rot. In the year 1182, it smelled of old grain, damp, and the iron of the anchor rings in the far wall, which had once been used for a purpose Sella had never described, and which Cain had the wit not to ask about. Marin had not chained her. The lock on the door was enough, and Marin was too careful to leave a mark that could be noticed by the wrong set of eyes. Cain had set her crock on the grain shelf and sat on the stone ledge that served as a bench, and she had waited. Above her, she could feel the keep filling. Not through walls, she had no wolf sense to speak of, her mother's blood having failed to grant her that particular inheritance in any form Marin would have acknowledged. But she could feel it as pressure, the way the very old stones transmitted sound when enough feet were moving on them. The scrape of boot heels on flagstone, Dress' voice in its carrying managerial register, the particular vibration of the outer gate drawing open for horses. The king had arrived. She knew the stories. Every pack-adjacent household within 2 days' ride of the Iron Hollow seat knew the stories of Aldrich Voss. That he had taken the kingship at 24 by standing in the reckoning circle after his predecessor's sudden illness, that the 3 challengers sent against him in the 3 years following had each withdrawn before the second strike, that he did not attend solstice gatherings at lesser keeps unless the tithe records warranted it, and that the warrant itself was usually a sign the tithe records were not, as the lesser keep had presented them. He was, the stories agreed, precise, cold, and not interested in ceremony for its own sake. He was, Sella had told Cain once, when the old woman had been called to Cain's sick ward room after a fever and had sat on the end of the pallet and spoken in the quiet way she reserved for important truths, also bond-starved in a way the court had long stopped mentioning. Cain had filed that information away without quite knowing what to do with it. In the cellar, she pulled her coat tighter and watched the narrow strip of gray light at the door's base and listened to the muffled ceremony above. She could hear the formal greeting lines, could not make out the words, but recognized the shape of them, the long, formal cadence of Marin's welcoming address, then a shorter response in a voice she did not know, and that landed through the stone with a quality she could not name exactly, a weight, as if the syllables carried density. She heard Drest call the roll of names. She heard the answering murmur of the assembly. She did not hear what stopped it. It stopped between one breath and the next. One moment there was the low preceding noise of 31 packmates at formal attention, and then there was not. She pressed her ear to the cold stone wall and heard nothing she could interpret, only a quiet that was not absence but something more like held breath, the entire upper keep pausing on a single point. She pulled back from the wall. Then the footsteps came. Not Drest's brisk official stride, not Marin's measured walk. These were heavier, deliberate, with the particular quality of someone who was not following a corridor but finding something at the end of one. 2 flights of stairs, each footfall distinct on the stone. Cain stood from the bench without making a decision to stand, the grain shelf edge pressing into her lower back, the crock of woundwort cool against her wrist. The door shook on its frame. Not a knock. The lock was a 6-inch iron bar seated in stone brackets, and whatever was on the other side took hold of the door itself, not the handle, and pulled. The stone brackets cracked on the second effort. On the third, the bar sheared at one end and the door swung inward, one hinge bending under the shift of weight, and the light from the stairwell corridor poured across the cellar floor. The man in the doorway was taller than the frame had been built to accommodate. He ducked it without noticing, which meant the shortfall in the architecture was something he had long stopped registering. He was dressed for a formal visit in dark wool and iron-stitched leather, not for labor, but the sleeve of his left arm had been pushed back to the elbow and the linen beneath it showed an old dressing gone dark with the particular rust brown of suppressed bleeding. His face was precise and cold exactly as the stories had said, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no category for, not the anger she expected, not contempt, not the proprietary assessment of a lord who had found something misplaced in his property. Something before any of those things. Something that had not yet become anything the face knew how to hold. She said, stupidly, "You have broken the door." A muscle moved in his jaw. The door was locked from the outside. She looked at the bar, sheared at one bracket. "I noticed." He stepped into the cellar and the stone room rearranged itself around him the way a room will when a very large and very still presence enters it. He was looking at the anchor rings in the far wall. He was looking at the grain shelf and the crock of woundwort and the old wooden bench. He was taking inventory of what she had been left with, and she watched the muscle in his jaw tighten again. "How long?" he said. "Since 3rd hour this morning." He said nothing to that. He did not need to say anything to that. Whatever he was thinking arranged itself into a stillness that was louder than speech. Cain's eye went, as eyes will, to the arm. The dressing had bled through fully now, the dark stain reaching the wrist. She moved before she made the decision to move, taking the crock from the shelf and pulling the stopper. "That wants changing," she said. The dressing. He looked at her. You are tending me. I am tending the wound. She held his gaze for one clear moment. The distinction matters. Something shifted in his eyes. She could not name it, and she did not try. She crossed the cellar and he stayed where he was, watching her approach with the stillness of something very old and very powerful that has decided, for reasons it has not yet examined, not to move. She unwound the dressing. The wound was a single deep score running the full length of the forearm, suppurating at the edges with the gray-white tinge she recognized from the keep's sick ward. The color of silver-touched flesh that has been closed too long without proper treatment. She had seen it before. A guard 3 seasons past, a trapped ankle against a silver-set fence post. The same color, the same persistent heat, radiating from the skin beneath her fingertips. This was in an ambush, she said. Not a question. 2 days prior. A pause that felt like it cost him something. It was important that it not be visible. She understood that in a language she did not need translating. He had come to a formal tithe inspection as the Alpha King of the Iron Hollow Pack, and he could not be seen to bleed, to ache, to require anything from anyone in the building. Power did not limp. Power did not carry suppurating silver wounds beneath its formal dressings and hope no one would notice the smell. She ground 3 pinches of woundwort in the crock's stone bowl, mixed in the small vial of clean water she had thought to bring for her own drinking, and worked the paste across the wound with her fingers. He did not flinch. She redressed it with the clean linen strip from her coat's inner pocket, which she had habitually kept there since Marin had assigned her the sick ward 3 years ago, and she tied it off and stepped back. He had not looked away from her face once during the whole of it. Your name, he said. Kane. She set the crock down on the bench. I was born Kane Nightshade, though I am not certain that is a name this house records as belonging to anyone. The tightness in his jaw was back. Above them, 2 flights of stone and the packed silence of 31 witnesses, and the household steward waiting, and Marin. She could picture Marin perfectly. Standing beside the hearth she had dressed in pine boughs, arranging her face into the smooth plane of a woman who had no idea why the king had left her welcoming address mid-sentence and gone toward the cellar stairs. If you have ever watched a careful plan start to pull apart at a corner, consider staying with this story, because the unraveling here had its own specific logic, and it was about to accelerate. He said, "Come upstairs." She looked at her hands, at the woundwort staining her fingers. She looked at his face. I am not dressed to be presented to a king. You are dressed as you are. His voice carried no inflection on this. It was simply a fact, the way weather is a fact. Come upstairs. She came. The stairwell was narrow and the light from the hall above fell in a long column. She could hear Marin's voice as they rose, low and controlled and aimed at someone near the hearth. A careful reconstruction of composure happening in real time. When Kane stepped through the door at the top of the stairs and into the hall, the silence that had been held since Aldrich had left it came undone into something else. A collective breath released and then recaught. 31 faces turning, the pine boughs and tallow light and formal arrangement suddenly containing one element no one had arranged for. Dressed saw her first. His face went through several things quickly. Then he said, in the voice he used when correcting a guard's posture, "This is no occasion for servants." Aldrich said, without raising his voice, "Name her again." Dressed closed his mouth. Marin had crossed from the hearth. She was composed, her posture exact, her eyes moving between Kane and Aldrich with the rapid, invisible calculation of a woman who is solving for several variables at once. "My Lord King," she said, "my stepdaughter has mistaken the hour. I will see her return to her quarters." "She was in the cellar," Aldrich said, "locked." For her own comfort. The preparation of the hall was considerable, and she finds large gatherings taxing. Marin's smile was the kind built to carry weight. She is not well suited to formal occasions. Cain heard Selah's sharp intake of breath from the far corner near the hearth, where the old woman had positioned herself in the shadow of the last bracket iron, gray linen nearly invisible against the stone, her small hands very still in her lap. Aldrich had turned to face Marin fully, and the geometry of the room changed. The 31 witnesses adjusting their positions in the subtle way bodies do when the apex of the room shifts. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. She carried woundwort in her coat, he said. She tended a wound that 3 healers at my keep have refused to touch because the silver in it would damage them. She asked nothing in return, and she did not leave the room. Marin's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. She is a household girl, my lord. She tends what needs tending. It is her function. I see, Aldrich said. He let the words settle. Then, what is her lineage? The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. Cain felt it against her skin the way cold is felt against skin, as a pressure. Marin said, her mother was of no particular line. From the corner, Cellar said quietly, that is not true. Every head in the hall turned. Marin's eyes moved to Cellar with a weight that was not anger but something older and more specific. The look of a person who has calculated an obstacle and decided how to remove it, and has now discovered the obstacle has chosen its moment. Cellar rose from her chair. She was small, and the hall was large, and she crossed it without hurrying, her gray linen coat making a soft sound against the flagstones. She stopped beside Cain and did not look at Marin again. She looked at Lord Fenwick, the council elder who had traveled with Aldrich's party and who stood at the right edge of the assembled witnesses with a leather-bound register open in his hands, his face a careful study in attentive neutrality. Her mother was Ilsa of the Thornwall line, Selah said, born into the old Iron Hollow blood right in the generation before the Reckoning's registry consolidated the minor houses. The lineage was not erased. It was failed to be recorded when this household was registered after the father's death. The old bonding law is clear that a blood right holder's descendant inherits the standing whether or not a guardian has performed the recording. She paused. My Lord Fenwick will know the statute. It is the 43rd clause of the Reckoning's foundational bonding codes. Fenwick's pen had been still for several seconds. He consulted the register, turned back 2 pages, and was very quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, the 43rd clause does apply. Marin said, this woman is a retired kitchen servant playing at pack law. She is the household's elder, Aldrich said, and she has named a statute that Lord Fenwick has confirmed. He did not look at Marin when he said the next thing. He was looking at Cain. What she has not yet named is what I followed through 2 flights of stone. Cain held his gaze. My Lord King. The scent recognition, he said, is not a thing I misread. The hall was very still. Selah said, almost to herself, no, it wouldn't be. It is the oldest right in the bonding law. Earlier than any registry. Then the trouble came. Marin had moved, and it was the particular movement of someone who had prepared for exactly this contingency and was now deploying it. She had reached Drest's side, and something passed between them, and Drest put a small ceramic vial on the side table near the wine service, with a gesture that was supposed to look incidental. A steward adjusting a surface. Cain saw it. She had spent 3 years watching Drest's hands in this hall, cataloging his small, precise movements the way any person catalogues the gestures of those who have authority over them, and this was not incidental. She knew what it was because she had seen Marin consulting the locked box in the stillroom 2 nights past, when Cain had been passing the stillroom door with a bucket, and Marin had not noticed her. The smell from the box had been wolfsbane and old iron, a smell she knew from the sick ward, from the one case she had treated where a pack member had been dosed against their will, and she had worked for 4 hours to stabilize the breathing. She said, Drest, move away from the table. Drest looked at her with the expression of a man who has been corrected by furniture. "You have no authority here." "The vial," she said, louder now, turning to Aldrich. "The ceramic vial near the wine service. Do not let anyone touch it," Marin said in her smoothest voice. "She is embarrassing herself." But Aldrich had already turned. His eyes found the vial on the table and held there, and Kane watched something in his face go precisely quiet. The way a predator goes quiet. Not relaxed, but concentrated. He took one step toward the table. Drest's hand moved. It was not meant for the king. It was meant to seem like an accident. The steward reaching for the wine jug and brushing the vial, tipping it toward the nearest cup. But Aldrich was already moving, and his hand caught the vial before it reached the cup, and in the catching, his thumb pressed the stopper, and in the pressing, the stopper gave, and a half measure of the draught, pale, greenish, and sharp with the smell Kane recognized from the still room, ran across his palm and into the dressing she had just tied. He set the vial down on the table. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Kane felt it, not saw it, felt it as a drop in warmth, as something that had been building since the cellar pulling thin, as if the room had lost pressure. He had not drunk it. The dressing had absorbed a half dose through the wound's raw edge and the silver-touched skin, which was more permeable than whole flesh. She knew this from the sick ward. She knew exactly what permeable silver-touched skin did with wolfsbane and iron compound in a partial dose. He was upright. He would remain upright for some time by will alone. She knew that too. She crossed the hall in 12 steps and put her hand on his arm, the dressed forearm, and looked up at him. He was looking back at her with the precise, cold face and the eyes that had gone very dark, and she could see the effort in the stillness, the same kind of effort as the suppressed wound, the same refusal to let the body's distress be visible. "Kane," he said. Her name, only her name, and the way he said it was not a question, and not a command, and not any category of sound she had a word for. His hand was on hers, the uninjured hand, his fingers closing once around her wrist before releasing. Cellar was at her shoulder, low and quick. "The partial dose will not sever a bond that has been witnessed," she said. "The old law requires naming before the bond can be severed by any compound. If he names it here, before Fenwick, before the assembly, the severance draft cannot complete against it. It will pass through him and leave no permanent effect." She paused. "If he does not name it within the turn of 1 hour, the partial compound will work on what has not been claimed, and it will take the forming bond with it." Kane looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at wounds, clearly, without flinching, taking the full account of what was before her. She said, "You do not have to." She meant it. She had spent 3 years being told what she was, and she had stopped requiring things of people who had been given authority over her, and she was not about to require this of a man she had known for the span of a cellar and a staircase, however the staircase had felt, however the cellar had felt, however her hand felt right now under his. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to face the hall. The 31 witnesses were not moving. Fenwick's pen was raised. Marin had gone the particular color of someone who has watched a plan complete its reversal and not yet reached the part where she knows what to do. Drest was very still against the wall. Aldrich said, in the voice that had carried through 2 flights of stone without effort, "I name Kane of the Thornwall Iron Hollow line as my bonded mate before the witnesses assembled in this hall, before the council elder Lord Fenwick, and before the record of the Iron Reckoning. I name her before the severance attempt, and after it. I name her in the hall above the cellar she was locked in, and I name her in the presence of those who locked her there. Let it be entered. Let it hold." The light came from the wound dressing. Kane had not expected that. She had not expected any of it. Not the heat that ran up her arm from where his hand had briefly held her wrist. not the way it moved beneath her skin in branching lines the color of banked coals, visible through the back of her hand, up her forearm, fading at the elbow. Around her wrist, the same light answered from the dressing on his arm, both of them connected for a single suspended moment by something that was not visible, but was felt by every person in the hall as a change in the air, a pressure releasing, a door swinging open at the end of a long corridor. Then it faded. The hall breathed. Fenwick was writing. Sella's hand on Kane's back was very warm. Aldrich did not look away from her face. He looked at her the way a person looks at the one thing that has been true the entire time, that has been true before he arrived, and before the tithe inspection, and before Maren had arranged the pine boughs and extinguished the candle on the cellar stairs. The deniable cracks she had seen accumulating since the cellar door had fallen, the stillness when he looked at the anchor rings, the muscle in his jaw, her name spoken in a register she had no category for. None of it had been deniable to anyone in this room but her, and she understood that now with the full clarity of a woman who has spent too long being told that what she perceived was not what was actually occurring. Maren said, "This is irregular." It was, possibly, the least useful thing she had ever said. Lord Fenwick looked up from the register. He was a lean man of 60-odd years, with the careful diction of someone who had spent 40 of them transcribing pack law. And when he spoke, it was with the particular flatness of a person who has reached a legal determination and is not interested in disputing it. The naming is entered, the bond is recorded, the claim is witnessed by 31 packmates and 1 council elder of the Iron Hollow line, assembled in the year 1182 of the Iron Reckoning on the night of the sealed moon. The registry of Nightshade Keep is hereby corrected to reflect the Thornwall blood right and the standing of the claimant therein. He closed the register with a sound like a door shutting. Maren Nightshade's guardianship claim over the claimant is dissolved by the superseding bond right. The dissolution is immediate and requires no further process. Maren's composure had not broken. It had simply become insufficient for what it was being asked to contain. She looked at Kane with the expression of someone who has lost a very long game and cannot entirely account for when the losing began. Kane met her eyes. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which had always been in her imagination something like triumph or vindication, or the hot specific pleasure of a reversal. She felt instead a quiet that was close to exhaustion, a long pressure releasing through the soles of her feet into the flagstones. She looked at Maren's face and found that the need she had carried for this woman to see her had been answered in some form that did not require Maren's cooperation. She had been seen. The record confirmed it. Maren's seeing was no longer load-bearing. Aldrich said, "Maren Nightshade is to be escorted from the hall. She may take her personal property and 1 servant. She may not take Cellar. She may not take any item belonging to the Keep's registry or any document bearing the Nightshade name." He paused. "She will find no welcome in any Iron Hollow allied holding." Drest made a small sound. Aldrich looked at him. "You voiced her orders in this hall," he said. "That makes you her instrument of record. You will present yourself to Lord Fenwick before tomorrow's first light for a formal accounting. If the accounting is complete and honest, you will be released to find other employ. If it is not, you will answer to the reckoning." He did not elaborate. He did not need to elaborate. Drest's face confirmed that the elaboration had been supplied by his own imagination, which was apparently comprehensive. 2 of Aldrich's escort, who had been standing at the hall's far end with the stillness of men waiting for instruction, stepped forward and positioned themselves beside Maren. She went with them, still wearing the composed expression and the formal dress she had ordered for a king's welcoming, which was its own kind of ending, the woman who had arranged the pine boughs leaving through the door she had staged. Kane watched her go. The hall was not quiet now in the way it had been quiet. It was quiet in the way a room is quiet when everyone in it has arrived at the same understanding and is processing what comes next. Several of the 31 packmates had bowed their heads. Cain did not count how many, because she was looking at Cellar, who had returned to her chair near the hearth bracket iron, and who was not trying to stand or speak, or perform any of the gestures that situations like this seem to require. The old woman looked at Cain across the hall with the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a specific wheel to come around and has finally heard it arrive. Aldrich said, near her ear, "The compound is working through." She had not forgotten it. She turned to look at his arm. The dressing was dry now, the light that had moved under her skin having apparently resolved the silver contamination, along with everything else. But the wolfsbane did not work the same way, and she could see in the tightness around his eyes that the partial dose was not finished. "Sit down," she said. He did not immediately sit down. He was the alpha king of the Iron Hollow Pack, and sitting down before an assembly of 31 witnesses required a particular negotiation with his own habits. "Sit down," she said again, the way she said it to sick ward patients who were convinced they could stand unaided. He sat. She took the woundwort crock from where she had set it on the hearth ledge, found the last of the clean water, and worked a fresh draw of the poultice while Sella brought the folded linen from the sewing chest by the wall. The hall watched. No one said anything. Fenwick made a quiet notation in his register and then set it on the table and stood with his hands folded, which she recognized after a moment as a form of respect. She changed the dressing in the firelight. In the hall above the cellar she had been locked in, before the same 31 witnesses who had assembled to watch her stepmother present a version of Nightshade Keep in which she did not exist. She worked carefully. She tied off the ends. Aldrich's hand covered hers when she finished. Not the brief single grip from before, but a full, settled hold, her hand between both of his the way a person holds a thing they have decided to keep. She looked up at him. He had not made a speech. He had not explained himself in a paragraph addressed to a single listener. He had said 6 sentences before the hall and let the hall do the rest, and now he was holding her hand with the same quality of stillness as everything else he did, the stillness that was not absence but its opposite, a density of attention that had nowhere else it intended to be. "I should have asked your name in the cellar," he said. "You did," she said. "I gave it. I should have asked it before the door." She considered this. Outside the high windows the sealed moon was still over the Iron Hollow ridgeline, pale and fixed and very cold, the light it cast through the leaded glass laying long rectangles across the swept flagstones. She could smell pine boughs and tallow and the clean, sharp edge of new linen. She could feel the warmth of his hands and the warmth of the hearth, and, beneath both, the specific warmth she had first registered in the cellar and had been trying without success to name ever since. She said, "The door was locked." "Yes," he said. "It was?" The hall had settled into a different shape than any shape it had held before. Fenwick was inscribing the last lines of the registry correction with the small sound his pen made against the page. Several packmates had drawn closer to the hearth, not out of cold but out of the specific human pull toward a warm center when something important has resolved itself at one. Near the door, Sella had risen from her chair and was moving toward the kitchen passage, the gray linen coat making its soft sound on the flagstones, and Cain could see from the angle of her movement that she was headed for the good herb chest at the back of the pantry, where she kept the dried valerian bark and the compound she used for wolfsbane aftermath, because Sella had been doing this long enough to know that the compound did not finish quickly, and that whoever was sitting by the hearth was going to need a second treatment before morning. The iron anchor rings in the cellar 2 flights below would rust at their own pace. The grain shelf would hold other things. The door hung off one hinge in the rock-carved dark, sheared at its bracket, the lock bar on the floor in 2 pieces where the stone had finally given. Cain did not need to go back down and see it. She already knew what it looked like. She knew what open looked like. Sella returned from the kitchen passage with the valerian compound and the fresh water and set them on the table near the hearth without ceremony, and her eyes found Cain's across the room, and what passed between them needed none of the words that had already been used. The old woman lowered herself into her chair beside the fire, folded her hands in her lap, and rested. The sealed moon held its place over the ridge until the first gray edge of morning, which was longer than any moon that night, had a right to stay. The 31 witnesses would carry the account back to their households, to their packs, to every corner of the Iron Hollow territory that had believed, until the solstice of the sealed moon in 1182, that a locked door was the same thing as an absence. Fenwick sealed the registry page with the Iron Hollow mark before he slept. The wound healed fully by the 4th day, the silver tinge gone from the edges of the score as if it had not been there, the new skin beneath the last dressing carrying no gray discoloration, only the clean, pale line of a scar that had finished its work. Cain traced the length of it once with her fingertip, not to check it, but in the specific way of a healer confirming a thing she already knows. And Aldrich watched her do it with the eyes that had been watching her since the cellar, and that had acquired no additional concealment since. In the hall that had been dressed for a king, and that now held something no pine bough or tallow candle had been ordered to provide, the hearth kept its fire through the night. The crock of woundwort sat on the ledge where Cain had set it. It had been carried up from the cellar in her hands, 2 flights of stone, through a door that had been torn free of its frame by a man who had followed a scent through solid rock, because the oldest law in the Iron Hollow bonding codes said that scent right preceded registry, preceded guardian authority, preceded every arrangement a careful woman had made to keep a king's eyes from falling where they would fall, regardless. The ledge held the crock. The fire held its warmth. Sella breathed evenly in her chair, and Cain Nightshade, whose name had been entered in the registry of the Iron Reckoning on the night of the sealed moon, sat beside the hearth in the hall above the cellar, with his hand over hers, and the door below open at last to nothing but the dark and the quiet and the cold that no longer had any claim on her.